So, good evening and welcome to this second session of our Lent course, thinking about communities and community engagement. We're going to start this evening with some devotions. So let's start with those now. So first of all, we're going to have a Bible reading from the book of Philippians. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being in one spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but of the interests of others. And so with those words from Philippians, and as we think about all that we're going to engage in this evening, let's pray together. Let's pray. Loving God, as we come before you this evening in our Lent study from different places in the country and even in the world, we give you thanks that we can gather in this way, that we can be with one another and learn from you. So we ask that you will be in our conversing, that you'll be in our listening and in our speaking, that we might learn more of your will for our lives as we continue our Lenten journey and as we spend our time together this evening. So, loving God, be with us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, let's get into it then. It's a great joy, as I said, to have Hannah with us. And Hannah's part of the connectional team, and she is the I'm going to get her job title right. The Methodist Connectional Let's End Poverty Engagement Officer, I think. But I'm sure Hannah will correct me if I get that wrong. Hannah, do you want to just say hello to everybody so that they can see you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's lovely to see you all and be with you all this evening.
We're very
There we go.
grateful for your time, Hannah, and for your time this evening, but also your time a couple of weeks ago when we gathered and recorded an interview, which we're going to show in a minute. But before we do that, I just had one question, which I'm going to ask everybody, but I'm going to ask you first. When we're talking about community, and that's what we're kind of focusing on this evening, what's one word that comes to mind? Just one word.
I was going to say two, but they go
Okay, two.
together.
I'll give you two.
What came to mind for me was being known.
Being known. Okay. So there's a difficult question, I think. What's one word for community? Hannah's come up with being known. And so I'm going to ask you all, we're going to go straight into groups at the beginning this evening, and to just share with each other what's that one word or two that comes to mind for you when you hear us talk about community. Well, it's a joy to have you back in the room. I hope that you had some good conversation and you found it helpful. It would be really good if you wanted to just put the words, your community words, in the chat for me, and I'm going to use those at the end of the session. So it would be really helpful if you could put your word that you were thinking of in the chat. Does anybody want to share their word now with everybody that they came up with? Oh, we've got fellowship coming in, togetherness in the chat. I caring, inclusion, neighborliness.
Caring,
That's an excellent one. Caring. I'm going to just share my screen again with some other words that came up for me. If you're not on mute, if you could just try and pop yourselves on mute, that would be helpful. So here's some words. I did not put these words in, so we may or may not agree with them. But I found this image for community. So we've got give, love, humanitarian, work, diversity, togetherness, hope. So a whole range of different sorts of words, and it's good to see that you've come up with a whole range that are all coming through on the chat now. That's great. So keep those coming in on the chat so that we can see what words you've come up with. Well, I'm going to bring Hannah back into the conversation. Hannah, it's good to have you with us, as I said earlier. And I'm not sure if I got your job title right earlier. Do you want to just tell us your job title and you introduce yourself quite nicely in the video. So, but just what is it that you do and why are you here when we're thinking about community?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't think job titles really matter very much.
No.
What I do is I help the Methodist Church engage with the Let's End Poverty movement, which is one of the ways that we do our anti-poverty work in the UK. So we're trying to bring together a collective of people to campaign around an end to poverty in the UK. Yeah, that probably says more than my job title does. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm sure that's, well, we get into it in the video a bit more, but thank you so much. So we're going to watch the video now, which is the interview between Hannah and myself. It's about 17 minutes. It would be really helpful if while you're watching this video, you could make a note of anything that you find surprising, anything that you find encouraging, and any questions that you have. And if you can make a note of those things so that when we have a conversation at the end, those are the kind of areas that we're having around our conversation. So I'm going to put that into the chat. Anything that you find surprising, anything that you find encouraging, and then any questions that you have as a result of the conversation that we've had together. So I'm going to share my screen again so we can watch the video. Now, don't panic at first when there's no sound because it takes a minute or two for the sound to kick in, but I promise it's coming. So, Hannah, we're so delighted to have you with us for our Lent course and to share some of your experiences in the work that you do. I wonder if first of all, you could just tell us a bit about yourself and your role and what led you to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm Hannah. I've been living and working in London for the past 6.5 years, which feels very south for me because I grew up in York. So I didn't think I'd find myself in London, but I've ended up sticking around. And I worship as part of the congregation at High Street Methodist Church, so a close neighbour to Central Hall. I have worked for the Joint Public Issues team for the Methodist Church, leading on campaigns and engagement, and I was there for about 5 years before moving on to my current role, which is coordinating the Let's End Poverty movement. I think through all of this work, it's reminded me and kind of encouraged within me a real passion for activism and faith, really thinking about what it means to be somebody who's part of creating change in the world, driven by my own faith. And that's been something that's been really important to me right throughout my life.
That sounds amazing. And you've clearly been involved in some really challenging work, I imagine, but also really rewarding and fulfilling work in what you've been doing. So you mentioned that you work now with the Let's End Poverty movement. Some people here might have a really good understanding of what that is and been involved in it. Others perhaps maybe not so familiar. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about it and what that is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of snappy headline is that Let's End Poverty is a movement of individuals, churches, and charities who believe in a future where poverty can't keep anyone down. That's our kind of snappy title, but essentially we're a collective of people that was set up in October 2023 in anticipation of the general election that has happened in the UK, but we knew at that point was going to happen in the next sort of year or so. And the Methodist Church was a core partner in setting that up alongside lots of charities and organisations and groups that we work alongside of all faiths and none, really with a commitment to wanting to put tackling and ultimately ending poverty in the UK high up on the political agenda during the election period. And since the election, we've been thinking about how do we keep that change high on the agenda? How do we work with the new government, with all our communities, to make sure that poverty is something that we believe is morally unacceptable in our country, in our society, that actually poverty is on the rise and we need to take bolder action to tackle that. And I think probably something that's really core and important to the movement is that we believe that the best way to campaign against poverty is to do that in solidarity with people who are experiencing the struggle against poverty. And we often use a phrase kind of borrowed from our friends in the poverty truth movement, and lots of others use it as well, that nothing about us without us is for us. Really, we can't call for change unless we're doing it with people who are at the forefront of that struggle. So empowering and building up and amplifying people's lived experiences is really at the heart of what we do.
I find it it's amazing to hear about that work, and I've been involved in a very small way with the movement and the work that you're doing, and it feels big. It feels like big work that you're doing, and big issues. And I just wonder, through that work that you've done with the movement, you've talked about all those different communities that you've engaged with. Are there kind of some big issues that you see that face society, maybe that kind of spread across all those different communities, or maybe some particular examples of
Yeah.
what some of those issues are?
Yeah, it really is big, and we've gone big intentionally. The name is Let's End Poverty because we want to look at poverty as a whole issue, and often what we can do is kind of fragment it down into little micro issues, and that can be really important to get specific change. But actually, we really want to highlight the big picture, and that is that poverty in the UK is rising, but also the poverty that people are experiencing is getting deeper. So actually, more people are in deep poverty than ever before. And actually, there's some new statistics that were released earlier this year by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who do a lot of work helping us to understand what poverty in the UK looks like. It says that more than 1 in 5 people in the UK are experiencing poverty. And actually, the characteristic of that has shifted over the kind of the last few decades. That one of the most likely groups to be experiencing poverty are children. So actually, 4.3 million children in the UK are experiencing poverty. And that has been a switch. It used to be that older people, that pensioners were one of the most likely groups to experiencing poverty. And they've almost flipped in the charts with children and younger people who are experiencing that. And we know that they're a particular group, but that's exacerbated if you are somebody who comes from a particular background, particularly Black and global majority heritage communities. Children in those families are more likely to be experiencing poverty. If you live in the household with somebody who is disabled or who has a long-term illness, or you are somebody yourself who has a disability or lives with a long-term illness, or if you're a carer and that's one of your main priorities, whether that is of your children or of somebody who's got a long-term illness or a disability. So actually there are certain groups within that kind of really big amount of people who are experiencing poverty who are more likely to be affected. And I think one of the things that the kind of statistics really highlight um, are that actually the kind of challenges that people are facing aren't fixed by the temporary solutions that we perhaps once used. So you might be really familiar with things like food banks and that kind of emergency support like clothes banks or temporary hardship payments that are really important for people in a moment of crisis. But actually the kind of poverty that we're seeing in the UK today is kind of driven by a much more structural or by much more structural drivers behind that. So whether that is disability and illness, or whether that is policies that mean that people who are in particular circumstances can't access the support we need.
That is, it's all fascinating, and probably highlighting some things for people that we might not realize if we're not in one of those situations, or we don't know somebody who is. And you talked earlier about how important it is to be working with people who are within these groups, who are experiencing these types of poverty, and that's part of the fundamental part of the movement and how you're seeking to work. So I wonder if there are some stories that you could tell us of some of the people that you've met as you've been doing this role.
So there's two people particularly that come to mind are we've got a brilliant person called Ashley who's on our enabling group for Let's End Poverty. And she's been involved in kind of advocating around ending poverty for a long time from her own experience. She's based up in Halifax now, but she was relocated to Halifax essentially because there wasn't sufficient housing for her and her children in around London where she was from originally. So she was kind of almost forced to move up to Halifax to get the kind of housing provision that she needed for her kids. And in that experience realized that she wasn't the only person that was happening to. It was happening to lots of people. Actually, they were being pulled out of their communities and the families and the networks that they were part of. And it was making it even harder for them to get the support that they need and to move forward. And she is a brilliant advocate who really draws honestly on her own experience, but knows the importance of actually, if we don't take the time to listen to and understand people's experience, what it means to get out of poverty, not just with having enough money, but having those support systems around you, then those kind of decisions are going to become more and more frequent. They're going to be made by people who don't understand the reality of people's lives. And actually co-founded a charity called Mums on a Mission, who work at the grassroots in Halifax and in London to do that work of making sure that people know actually their voice and their experience really matters in making the change that we want to see. So Ashley has been a brilliant part of the movement and is a great example of actually moving one person's experience into being transformative for a wider community. And the other person that comes to mind is Stephen, who we've been working with over the last year or so to tour an exhibition of portraits that he's painted. So Stephen's an artist, he's based in Sheffield, and he painted a series of portraits of himself, but also of his peers who are experiencing poverty. They're all part of a community choir in Sheffield. And each portrait has something in it that represents the person's dream for the future, what they would do, who they would become, the things that they would explore if they had the chance to, but also something that represents the reality of the poverty that they're facing. And for some of them, that is forced relocation, like if they're a refugee, if they've been forced to come to the UK because of a crisis, or it's economic poverty that's created by those structural inequalities here. And this series of portraits, I think, has been so important because actually what Stephen's been able to do is take them into different communities and start a conversation about actually poverty isn't just about not having enough. It's about that being a limiting factor, about becoming all that we were made to be. If we put it in Christian terms, it's about recognizing our full potential that we were made with by God. And actually poverty being something that holds us back from that. And Stephen's been so generous with sharing his own experience through the self-portrait that he painted, but also in demonstrating to people that the arts and creativity and using those skills and gifts aren't necessarily something that needs to be separate from our fight for change, but can be part of the fight for change that we want to create. It can be a great way of starting those conversations and helping us to imagine a different future, not just to talk about what we want to change, but to really imagine something that could be possible. So I've got so much out of getting to know Stephen and Ashley and the whole range of people that we've worked alongside.
I wonder why, as a Methodist, you think that this work is important? Is there a driving factor there for you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think I can separate out my faith in God, my identity as a Methodist, and my love for justice. I think they've all been very formative parts of my life so far, and a part of my experience of growing up in a Methodist community. It's been brilliant to see Let's End Poverty kind of emerge and grow alongside the way that we're articulating what it means to be a justice-seeking church as the Methodist Church at the moment. You might have seen that as part of our work as a justice-seeking church, we have some principles for justice, and they're brilliant statements for kind of really putting into focus who do we believe that God is, and why do we believe that that means we're called to be justice-seeking. And one of those is the principle that God made humans in the image of God, each worthy of equal value and dignity. And I think that really highlights for us that kind of imagining of what better could look like, but also the reality that poverty is created and sustained by human beings in a way that denies that value and that dignity for people. So actually our work to restore that dignity, to respect and honour that dignity, is about taking down those barriers, about saying to people, actually, we believe that you have inherent value, you have inherent dignity because of who you were made by and how you were made. And that seeking to end poverty in that way is really a part of expressing that principle. But I also think there's something that is really inherently Methodist in our history about tackling poverty in particular as a justice issue, and poverty that is right on our doorsteps. We see it in Wesley's life and tradition of actually relocating his ministry to be amongst people who are on the margins. There's that brilliant quote that Wesley once said, which is, one great reason that the rich in general have so little sympathy for the poor is that because they so seldom visit them. we don't connect with people's experience because we distance ourselves from it. But actually, we are called to be people who don't just kind of donate money and pass the problem over there, but really move to places where we can be friends with, in community with, get to know and respect on an equal level people who are experiencing the struggles of injustice. And I think that actually, that being at the heart of the Methodist movement, alongside that commitment to raising up leaders from the community. The Methodist Church was founded on lay leaders who came up and out of the communities who were hearing the good news. That is part of the movement we're trying to build today through the Let's End Poverty, that is about saying, actually, we can build up and raise leaders from grassroots communities who have experienced the struggle against poverty, but want to use that to drive them to be good news, and actually saying that we can change this.
I think you've already touched on this a bit, but I wonder how some of what you've just said and what we've been talking about so far impacts us as Christians to make a difference in our local communities. I wonder if there's some practical things that you can share with us about what we could actually be doing.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing that is possibly easier said than done is about listening, about taking the time to really listen to and create space for people's stories to be heard. There's a brilliant Methodist theologian called Jörg Rieger, who talks about the concept of deep solidarity. And for him, that's about saying, it's great that we can do social action. We can feed people, we can make sure they have the things they need, we can volunteer to run the warm space. That's a good part of our expression of our faith. We can be advocates, we can campaign, we can write to our MPs, we can sign petitions, we can be out there with our placards if that's what we're called to do. And that is also really important. But if we don't do either of those things in real deep solidarity with people by knowing them and loving them and seeing God in them, we lose something. So actually, maybe the challenge for us is to start not in just in those actions, but in listening, and thinking about, is there a way that we could reshape the actions that we're choosing to do that grounds us in listening to somebody else's experience? That might feel hard if you feel like actually poverty isn't something that's close to your own experience. You don't feel like you maybe know people who are experiencing poverty. I think my challenge to you would be, can we take a little bit more time to question whether that is true? Is poverty something that's out there or over there? Or actually, is it something that's happening within our own community, our own church community, in our neighborhoods, on our streets?
And that's really helpful. And that challenge to say, what about in your own community? I think we like to think that poverty is something out there because it puts a bit of a distance, doesn't it? Makes it feel a bit safer. But in all likelihood, poverty is probably a bit closer to home than we might be willing to admit. And finally, we're in Lent. This is a Lent study. I wonder if there's perhaps a Lenten discipline or a Lenten action that we could include to help us to focus on reaching out to our communities in this season.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this for myself as well. What am I going to be doing this Lent? And I've been challenged a little bit recently by the sense that actually often our Lenten disciplines come from a desire to kind of draw on a sense of scarcity, an absence of something to make us, create space for God. And that can be a really helpful discipline sometimes, but particularly when we think about poverty. Scarcity is a language we use all the time when we talk about poverty. It's always about not having enough or there not being enough to go around. And I've been wondering whether I could, this Lent, flip that a little bit and challenge myself to notice abundance. So instead of choosing to deny something, can I notice an abundance of things in the world? Is that about noticing that in nature, in wildlife, or in the communities that I'm part of, or the people that I live and worship and work alongside? If I kind of took up the discipline this Lent of noticing abundance, how might that help to kind of rewire my sense that actually we're not just seeking to overcome scarcity, but to affirm that God provides in abundance for us? And actually, if we live in that way, what might change?
I think that's a wonderful way of kind of challenging some of our preconceptions and living in that truth that God does provide abundantly for us. Hannah, thank you so much. It's been fascinating, and I'm sure we're going to get some good questions back from people. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, my huge thanks to Hannah for giving her time and for that interview. I found it really interesting, and even though I was the other side of that interview, I was making lots of notes of things that I found surprising and interesting and questions. So I hope that you were equally doing the same and had lots of notes that you were making. Hannah, is there any immediate reflections that you have that you would like to offer to us before we go off into groups to have a think about that? You can
No,
say no.
I was just noticing I felt challenged by myself at the end there to keep up that Lenten practice. So I'm glad to have been reminded of that this evening.
Yeah, and it is a challenging one to that noticing of abundance and challenging that scarcity narrative. So, yeah, thank you so much. So we're going to go into groups. You're going to have 10 minutes in groups, so you've got a bit of time. And just a reminder, those 3 areas that we were asking you to have a think about were what did you find surprising? What did you find encouraging? And then any questions that you have. We will have quite a bit of time when you come back to respond to some of those questions, to have a bit of a conversation with Hannah. So it'd be good if you could come back armed with some of those questions to pop in the chat or to ask, so that we can have some good conversation. So we'll have about 10 minutes, so until about 10 to 8 now in groups, having that conversation. Really good conversations in your rooms. Does anybody have any questions? So you can either pop questions in the chat, or if you'd like to just ask it, that's fine. Put your hand up if you know how to raise your hand on your reactions button. That's the most helpful way, because then I'll see you pop up. But if you just wave madly at me if you don't know how to do that, and I'll try and keep an eye out for you. But any questions from your groups for Hannah? Anybody waving?
Yeah, all comments and reflections as well.
Yeah,
I always love
yeah.
hearing from different people about what you thought too.
So I've had an interesting question from Brian. Hannah, what is the definition of poverty?
It's not a very straightforward question to answer because people use different definitions. The one that we tend to use and the one that the government tends to use is measuring people who have 60% or more less than the average household income after they've paid for their housing costs. And that tends to be how we measure poverty. And that's called, I think the title that would be relative poverty. So that's actually measuring it against what the average person in society has. Sometimes we also have absolute poverty, which is measured against a kind of historical data line. But I think that's not necessarily a very helpful measure because it sets things back to maybe how things were at a certain point in time rather than how things are today. But I think one thing I would say on that is we tend to not begin with that because sometimes it can reduce the impact of poverty to just thinking about how much money somebody has, and that is obviously a key factor in poverty. It's kind of what defines poverty particularly. But there's a bigger conversation about what poverty does to us socially, to our well-being, to our relationships. And a model that some people use is talking about the web of poverty. So we might talk about economic poverty, but also poverty of identity or poverty of relationships that help us to reflect on what poverty does to us as human beings. That's not just about the money in our bank account or our housing situation. So that tends to open up a bit more to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very interesting, in that we always want to have those kind of really clear parameters and guidelines, don't we? But nothing's ever quite as straightforward as we'd like it to be. I can see that Jane and Graham have got their hand up. Did you have a question, comment?
Yes, Hannah, you are an inspirational young lady. And tonight I've been deeply shocked and saddened by the statistics, 4.3 million children in deep poverty, and yet hugely encouraged as well by the amazing work that's going on. I wonder how do you switch off from it all? How do you go home and switch off? Because the work you're doing is, is amazing.
That's a really good question, Jane, and a good challenge for me as well to think, how often do I think of that question for myself? Because it can be quite intense work doing activism and engaging. I mean, I do plenty of things which I like, reading and being outdoors and going to the theatre and having all of those things, and having my kind of friends and family around me really helps. But I think I've been really surprised doing this work, that there are places that are really energizing in the work, like you say, really encouraging as well as challenging. And the more I find myself in a room with people who are working in their local community to make a difference, the more energizing the work is rather than saddening. Sometimes it is really hard because I'll have phone calls with people who we work alongside who say, like, do you know what, at the moment this is really challenging, or this particular thing's happened and we just don't have the tools to help them in that situation. But the more I get away from, reading all the data and sitting and reading all the papers about it, and the more I spend time in a room with people who are getting on with doing something about it, it's actually really energizing work. Yeah, and that's been a real gift of this work, I think, for me, and has made me think, actually, I think justice seeking and activism is part of my vocation. It's part of who I want to be and what I want my life to look like. So I need to make sure that's a really big part of it, for it to be sustainable. But thank you for asking that. I'm going to challenge myself to think about that a bit more, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane. I think that's for any of us in the work that we do, to ask ourselves that question. We've had a couple of questions in the chat. Sandy has asked, several of us have seen or know folk who have been moved out of their home or their area for rehousing, almost without much choice. And you shared a bit about Ashley, Hannah, in the video. Is it very common that happens?
I think it's more common than we might realise. I don't know the kind of statistics around it, but I think the lack of social housing and adequate social housing in communities, particularly in areas where there's a bigger increase or a higher population of people who need to draw on social housing, it's actually really common. I don't think she'll mind me sharing this, but like Ashley, her housing situation is still unstable. Like, she's been moved, but she's still not secure, and that's really tough. Like, it's not something that just gets sorted once because you've been moved once. And we've got a brilliant somebody else, Tyra, who shares her story with us, and she talks about her own experience of having to be, well, they were evicted from their home when she was a teenager. Her mum wasn't able to work because of an injury. And she's part of something called a Poverty Truth Commission, where people locally who have experience of poverty work with local leaders to try and find solutions. And Tyra and her mum worked with the local housing association who they were evicted by, to address what causes people to be evicted. Are there things that we can do earlier on to intervene to make sure people can stay in their homes? And they managed together to reduce evictions by 75% from that housing association. So sometimes it's not just that the housing isn't there, it's that we're not taking the time to think about actually what helps people build a stable home and stay in it. So I think we always say in Let's End Poverty, all of the solutions exist to address these problems. We know we need more homes. We know we need better understanding of what helps people stay in their homes. What's missing often is the willingness of political leaders to pick those solutions up and use them. And it's only by developing those relationships, like Tyra did with the housing association, that changes. So yeah, I think it is actually really common, and something we need to highlight more publicly.
I was really shocked by that reduction of 75% of people being evicted from their homes. I mean, surely there's some lessons there that could be shared across councils, but anyway, just highlights, doesn't it, when there are solutions out there that can be put in place. Thank you. Becky has asked, what recommendations do you have for what we could practically do to help in a small way?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's always that, we talked about a little bit in the interview, but if we think about our action to respond to poverty as kind of 3 different strands, there's the practical stuff of helping people get the resources that they need when they need it. like food banks are really struggling to get the food that they need to address the demand for their services. If you can donate to your local food bank, whether that's through money or through going, usually if you go on their website, you can see a list of things that they need. I think sometimes we presume that they have stuff because that's, people pop something in at the end of the supermarket shop, or, that there's a regular donation. Like we hear of food banks running out of food a lot. So if you can find out where your local food bank is and donate to them, I think that's a really good first step of like the practical action. The second is taking an action around, maybe an issue that you've heard about tonight or something that you're seeing in the news that helps to highlight it with our political leaders, with our MPs. I can maybe find a link and share it, but one of the things we're particularly focusing on this week is you might have heard in the news a lot of conversation about potential reduction in disability benefits and disability support payments for people who receive universal credit or welfare support, or something called PIP, which is a disability support payment. I think as charities who work with people who are experiencing poverty, we're really worried about the potential impact of those kind of cuts, and worried that they could hurt people more than they can help them. We're expecting some announcements on that next week. So we're really encouraging people to write to their MP now to say to them, actually, we're concerned about this. Will you speak up about it in Parliament? And so I can share the link in the chat. The Trussell Trust have put together a template email where you could email your MP, add your own personal message, and make sure that they hear a concern around that. And that helps us just take it a little bit beyond the immediate and into the bigger picture. And I think that then that third strand that we talked about in the interview is it's a really little thing, but if you know somebody who might be struggling with some of this, taking the time to ask how they are and to listen. I did some work recently with some lived experience of poverty ambassadors, so people who have experience of poverty and share it. And that was one of their encouragements, was actually this isn't a problem that goes away quickly for people, even if it feels like it might be solved on the surface. It stays with people, the impact of poverty. So just calling somebody and asking how they're doing is a really good little step. Might not feel very direct, but is really important. So I think three things that you could do. There's always plenty. So
Thank you so much, Hannah. Somebody's asking about links, so I'll pick that up at the end and make sure you've got the links there. Any other questions or comments or thoughts in response to what Hannah? Yes, I can see somebody waving. You haven't got a name, but it says Samsung. Did you want to ask a question? You just need to unmute.
Yeah. I at Lent we usually give something up, but the last 3 years I've take something up instead of giving something up. I save either £5 a week or £10 a week, whatever I can, and I give that to a charity, to a food bank. It's not an awful lot, but every little helps, as the saying goes.
Wonderful, thank you. That's a really practical thing that we could all do, and that idea of that in Lent, taking on something as opposed to giving up something.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we've got time for one more. If there's anybody else that has a comment or a question. While you're thinking, what I was really struck by Hannah talking about Stephen and the self-portraits and how that art has been used to engage communities with poverty. Obviously, last week we were thinking in our study around art and faith and how that connects. And I could wonder if you could tell us a bit about how those portraits that Stephen has painted have been engaging with people. How have you used that artwork that he has produced?
Yeah. So I think for about almost exactly a year, the portraits went on tour around the UK, and community groups hosted them in their context and put on events around them, usually many of which involved a community choir, because that was a lovely connection with where they'd come from. But more often than not, they involved conversations with people in the community who had experience of poverty, think about how they could share their stories. And so often just seeing the stories that were shared through Stephen's portraits helped people understand the power of their own voice. but also that they could engage in a conversation that wasn't just about saying what they struggled with, but what they dreamed for and longed for. The portraits are now they had a homecoming event in Sheffield, and they've gone back to the people who they're painted of, so that they can have them and use them in the way that they would like to, kind of representing the fact that it's really their dream that the portraits represent. But I think the most powerful thing about them is it moved us from a conversation about problems and solutions into to that dreaming, imaginative work of what better looks like. Now, the project that the portraits came from and the work that they came from wasn't inherently Christian, but I think there is something so biblical about that, kind of starting with a dream and starting with a vision for what better looks like. That weaves right through the Bible and right through what God calls us to do, is to dream of God's kingdom come, and actually then think about how we want a journey to get there together. And so I think the power of the art was taking us to a much more imaginative place, and that helps us open our eyes to the potential, not just problems. So I think it's inspired us to do a lot more work like that.
Thank you so much. I kind of wish that I had been able to experience that and see that, but I'm sure they're available online to have a look at. But thank you so much. So you've got one hand up, Roswitha.
Thank you. And it's more of a comment, but I was going to say one of the things that was raised in our group was kind of disparity. And I think it's one of the things that makes poverty worse, and it's kind of relative poverty. For example, where a number of us live in North London, there is so much wealth, and yet the borough is so mixed, where there is exactly the opposite as well. And so that whereas most of us are kind of impacted by escalating prices, for many it doesn't really have any impact on their lifestyles, and others so much more. But it's the relativeness of everything, and the disparity, as well as the actual reality of not having.
Yeah, thank you so much. And when you're living side by side, in community, I mean, that's one of the great joys when there's, community diversity in community, but it can be more challenging, can't it? When you really see that brushing up side by side. Right. Hannah, any comments on that?
No, I think absolutely. And inequality is a big thing that's come up right through the conversation. You can't really take inequality and poverty apart, because actually it's one of the ways to address it, reducing. And do we want a world where inequality has changed just because more people are struggling, or do we want a world where actually that gap is closed, everybody is able to have what they need to thrive? So I think we need to always hold on to inequality and poverty together.
Yeah. And I mean, I work with young people, and I think it's particularly hard on young people and children, because there just seems such an unfairness about it.
Thank you. Brian, our last comment to you. Let's see, you've got your hand up.
Hello. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about this issue that you raised of noticing abundance and not just challenging scarcity. I mean, that's an easy thing for people who are not in poverty, or, it's a good thing to say to them, notice how fortunate you are. But to people who are in poverty, how does it apply there?
Yeah, it's a good challenge. Maybe the most helpful way to answer that is to tell you a story about a church in America. We've been learning a little bit from a Methodist leader in America called Mike Mather. He has written a little bit about the church that he works alongside, where they've taken the approach of something that technically we call asset-based community development. So it's all about noticing the assets in the community rather than the deficits, especially important in communities where their economic income and resources might be quite low. And what they do in their church is they realized that when people came in asking for help with something, they get them to fill out all these forms asking about what they needed. And it put them, the first introduction to who they were began with what are you missing? What are you lacking? What do you not have? And it created this dynamic between the church of provider and somebody in need, which actually wasn't helping them to see this person in all they were in God's image, as maybe they talked about in church on a Sunday. So they flipped around what they asked people when they came in. So they made sure, you know, they could help people with what they needed if they had the resources. But they also asked people, what skill or gift do you have that you could teach somebody else? And they became a church who said, if you have something you can teach and 3 people who want to learn it, we'll give you the space to run a class. And actually, that completely changed the narrative around saying we recognize that even though materially you might be struggling with what you have, you are so much more than that. So the assets you have and the gifts you have are there in abundance because of who you were made as. It's actually about working to uncover some of those things. So I think it can sound trite if we go in saying, be thankful for everything that we have. And actually, if you're sat there struggling, you hear that as, well, you're just not listening to what I'm struggling with. You're not noticing the reality of my life. But maybe it's about asking different questions, and about saying, you know, I want to make space to get to know all of who you are, and see this community for all it can be, not just for the things that have been taken away from it or the things that we're struggling to access. That's, you know, we still have to address those things. It's not just about glossing over them, but about recognizing there's more to everyone and to every situation than the things we lack.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah. That has been so fruitful, and incredibly interesting. And I'm sure that everybody here has really been grateful for your time and your expertise and giving that to us this evening and sharing with us. We are very grateful to you. As we finish, I'm going to just show those words that we said at the beginning, when I invited you to put into the chat a word that for you said something about community. And so I've put those words that you said into a word doodle. And so this is what it looks like. Those are the words that you said, talked about neighborliness, caring, common, together. And the words that are bigger were there more than once. So that gives you a sense of what we were saying. And as we finish this evening, I wonder if the word that you said at the beginning is still the word that you would say at the end. Is there a different word that comes to mind now after our study, or is it still the same? I'm not going to ask you to respond to that. That's just something for you to take away and to think about when you're thinking about community. I will share this with you when I send out the reminder next week for the Lent study. So I'll send this to you so you can see it if that's helpful. So as we finish thinking about community and being together, we're going to just finish with a hymn together. And again, as we sing this hymn, as we hear these words, do feel free to sing along, but just make sure you're on mute, because with the joys of Zoom, we'll end up all out of time with one another. But we'll just finish with this hymn and then we'll say the grace as we finish this evening. And so as we finish, I'd like to say once again a huge thank you to Hannah for all that she shared with us, to Francis, who's been helping with the technical things, and you all for coming and participating, and I hope you've gained a lot from it. Next week, we're looking at transforming the nation, justice and law, and we'll be hearing from Sir Robin Spencer, who's KC, and Howard will be back with us leading that session next week. As we finish, I invite you to unmute yourselves, and we're going to say the grace together. I shall put the words in chat so you've got those in front of you, and let's say this together. The grace of our
Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, the fellowship of the Holy Spirit, be with us all
forevermore.
Amen.